Okay, welcome everybody. Thanks for being here. We are thrilled to have Milena Almagro with us today, who we've been wanting to get over to this Colloquium for a while now. I'm glad we finally accomplished that. So Milena is an associate professor in Booth, where she's also the George G. Rinder Faculty Fellow, and her work is really on urban economics, but using tools from industrial organizations. So really distinctive mix for her, and she's worked on topics that interest, I think, all of us in this room, including urban transportation, public housing, gentrification, racial segregation, and her research has been published in all the journals it should be, all the best ones. And prior to coming to Booth, she was at the Minneapolis Fed, and she got her PhD from NYU and originally came to us from Madrid. So we're thrilled to have you here with us, Milena. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for the invitation. I have to give a big shout out to all the students that I have in the room. Yeah, it's really good to see your faces. So today I'm gonna present choices or constraints, separating preferences from restrictions in housing markets. This is joint work with Alaria Su. We've been working on this for many, many years. We've been working on this for 6 years. But some results are still preliminary. I'll let you know which ones. And yeah, I'm looking forward to getting your feedback on that. Okay. So to motivate to present the project, the main question that we're after is, what are the drivers of residential choice? And why do we think that this question is interesting? Because we have a lot of evidence that residential choice shapes many outcomes that are important for the well-being, such as opportunity, mobility, labor market outcomes, consumption inequality, etc. Now, observed residential patterns are very hard to interpret because those can reflect two things at the same time. On the one hand, they're going to reflect what households want. We're going to call that demand-side preferences. And in here, I want you to think about group-specific preferences for neighborhood factors, such as zoning or access to public transportation, etc. They can also reflect preferences for living near households with the same background. In the urban economics literature, this is sometimes referred to as homophily bias. But on the other hand, they might also reflect what households can choose from, which we're going to call restrictions on choices. What goes into these restrictions? You can have implicit discrimination from landlords and realtors, financial or information constraints, or explicit de jure discrimination, which is no longer legal in the US. However, it was legal in the era of the context of others. So concretely, what is it that we're going to do in this page? Our research questions are, how much of the observed residential choice or the observed residential patterns that we see in the data comes from household preferences versus choice-set restrictions? And how much of these choice-set restrictions are shaping equilibrium outcomes, such as prices and segregation? So how we're going to answer those questions? The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to build a novel historical data set linking households to neighborhoods and racial covenants. We're going to show that racial covenants that are de jure restrictions shape who ended up living where. After showing some reduced form evidence, we're going to move on to a structural model that is going to allow us to separate what comes from preferences versus choice-set restrictions. And armed with our stimulant model, then we're going to go into counterfactuals and try to answer how things will look like in the absence of these restrictions, how prices change or how segregation changes in the absence of choice-set restrictions. Sorry about this. It's a little bit up because I was changing this morning, but how are we going to contribute to the literature? There's a big literature in urban economics talking about residential choice, racial and ethnic segregation. The way we're going to add to this literature is by disentangling the role of preferences versus choice set restrictions. Then we're going to contribute to the literature on how policy design contributes to segregation. And in here, what we are going to look at is concretely, we're going to quantify the role of de jure and explicit restrictions and implicit discrimination. And in the context of the estimation of latent choice sets that comes from the industrial organization, what we're going to think about is we're going to put the methodology developing this literature in the context of a housing market, and we're going to measure equilibrium effects and how endogenous composition changes in response to changes in restrictions. Okay, so this is the roadmap of the talk. Let's jump right into this. So we're going to go back to Minneapolis to 1940s. This is a city that is expanding outward in a dramatic way. This is the time in which Minneapolis is being urbanized and in which farmland is being converted into suburban subdivisions. So think about these developments that have identical houses, many of them. The way it works is that real estate developers bought a plot of land, platted the land into the city registry, and develop and build the development. Decisions of who to sell to or to rent was made by the developers. So we're going to be thinking at developments as our geographical unit. We're going to call those also neighborhoods. So I'm going to use those terms, development, neighborhood, interchangeably throughout the talk. At the same time, in terms of the population, it's a city that is growing. And we have a ton of European immigrants coming to Minneapolis back in the day, and a small but growing not white population. Why I want to bring this up? Because while today we think about minorities as racial minorities, this was not the case back in the day. Not only racial minorities were a minority, some white ethnic groups were considered minorities during this time. So now let me define what racial covenants are. So racial covenants are basically a restriction that is comes as the clause of your property deed, and literally prevents the sale, use, or rental of the premise to a specific or a certain ethnic group. And here you have an example. So concretely, and I'm going to quote literally, it says that the premises hereby shall not at any time be conveyed, mortgaged, or leased to any person or persons of Chinese, Japanese, Moorish, Turkish, Negro, Mongolian, or African blood or descent. So let me show you some other examples. So in here, the restriction is gonna come, where is it? So for example, rent or, so agrees not to sell or rent or permit said premises to be occupied by persons of African or Semitic race. So as you can see, it's not only about race, there's also religious discrimination. And in here, this is a covenant that comes a little bit later. And in here, the restriction is to people other than the Caucasian race. Let me go. So 90% of these covenants were added by real estate developers at the time of platting the land. And typically, a developer added covenants to the entire development or didn't add covenants at all. In Minneapolis, the first covenant that we see is in 1911 and peaked in popularity in the 1930s, but they are declared unenforceable by the Supreme Court ruling of Shelley versus Kramer in 1940. Okay, so what is the data that we have? We're gonna look with the 1940 individual census counts, which is the 1940 census is a census with exceptionally good quality. Why? Because we see at the person level, the red, the country of origin that is gonna allow us to back out the ethnic background of this person, rents for renter-occupied houses, house values for owner-occupied houses, etc. We're also going to digitize the historical street grid from Sanborn insurance maps. We're gonna have data at the house level of the covenants that I showed you in the past, in the past two slides. We're going to digitize also the boundaries of these real estate developments to have a sense of what neighborhoods were back in the day. And we're also gonna digitize other characteristics such as the 1913 streetcar map. Why? This is gonna give us access to public transportation, wetlands. This is gonna give a measure of amenities. Lakes in Minneapolis, for some reason, are very popular, and rich areas tend to be next to small lakes. And we're gonna digitize the land use, the historical land use, to basically understand where the jobs were or where the industrial zones were, etc., etc. We're also going to digitize enumeration districts, which is the historical equivalent of census tracts. Okay, so what is it that we want to do with this data? So the first question that we wanted to answer is, do racial covenants have any bite in how people are, like, in the choices of where people live in the city? So in order to do that, we need to measure how covenants affect the residential choice, or where do we see households of different ethnic groups. So if you do a naive approach and then you try to map covenants and the individual records on the present day street grid, what's gonna happen? So if you do this naive spatial merge, we're gonna get a match rate that is lower than 45%. Why is that happening? Because many things have changed since 1940. We have the construction of the highways, of the interstate highways. We see large urban renewal projects and other large infrastructure projects that completely or change considerably the urban landscape since 1940. So what is it that we're gonna do? We're gonna digitize these Sanborn insurance maps. We're gonna do it for 6 cities inside the metro area of Minneapolis that covers 92% of Hennepin County, which is the county where Minneapolis lives. Then we're also gonna digitize the boundaries of these developments. In here you see an example with some of the names of these developments. And then we're also going to, once we digitize all of this, we have a historical street grids with the boundaries of these different developments. And then we're gonna link not only the households, but also the racial covenants. Once we do this, we're able to link 98% of households to one of these developments that we digitize. Importantly, why we have to do this? I mean, and this is what took us several years, and we did this pre-AI era. So now probably it would take a few months, but for us, it was not, because there was a lot of manual work involved. But the reason why we couldn't stay with the 45%, households that were matched is because the things that survive are not random. So if you only keep that match, those households that are matched, you're gonna get a selected sample, which is gonna bias the rest. Okay, so what is it that we see? To the best of our knowledge, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, because probably you know more, at least in economics, this is the first time that we can see how, for a metro area, how different households were locating where, based on a historical street. So in here I have different ethnic groups. For example, non-white, I don't know if you can see it really well, but they concentrate along the Mississippi River. Why? Because this is where the industrial areas were with the mills. And Northern European households were much more spread around the city. Other immigrants, we see that they're more prevalent. Okay, so now that we have digitized the data, we can finally answer the question whether covenants had any bite in how, if covenants had any bite in how these maps end up looking. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna regress an indicator whether that is gonna tell us whether if you belong to a certain ethnic group on the share of covenants as well as some controls. Importantly, we're gonna throw in the enumeration district control, which is equivalent to an enumeration census tract fixed effect. But even after controlling for census tracts and only using within census tract variation or enumeration district variation, we have an endogeneity problem. Why? Because we have we know from previous work, my co-author has a paper on covenants that shows that covenants today are more prevalent in median income areas, which tells us that maybe the location of covenants is not completely random, even after all of these controls. So what is it that we're gonna do? We're going to construct an instrument that relies on these three facts. The first fact is that the city, so here I'm showing you maps of the share of developed land in every of these developments. So as you can see, development is expanding outwardly. The purple dots are the placement of the covenants. And as you can see, we have some covenants in the first 10 years, some covenants in 1930, and way more covenants from 1930 until 1939. And the idea is that covenants, they peak in popularity during the 1930s. They were added by real estate developers. Most of them were added by the real estate developers. So the idea behind this instrument is try to predict where new construction happens at the peak of popularity of covenants. So how we're gonna do that? We're gonna divide the city into equal sectors. And then we're gonna construct something that we call the urbanization frontier index. What is this instrument? We're going to construct buffer zones around a development. We're gonna take a buffer zone of 1 kilometer toward the city center, and we're gonna measure how many of the lots were built by 1930. Why? Covenants are peaking, their popularity peaks in 1930 or in the decade of 1930. So with this instrument, we want to predict what's gonna build next after 1930. So this is kind of the urbanization frontier index. So in terms of the validity of data, we have to check two things. First, the relevance. The relevance is whether developments that were built by, next to the development, the urbanized frontier, were more likely to have covenants or not. This can be tested. We're going to show evidence of that in the next slide. And second, we need to assume an exclusion restriction, which is where that covenants the urbanized frontiers does not predict race, but other than through covenants. Meaning, so why do we think this is plausible? Why do we think there is nothing else predicting where race or where certain minorities are going to go using the urbanized frontier, if not through covenants? Because the urbanized frontier, the way we think it's conditional on being on the urbanized frontier, the exact plot of land that is converted from farmland into an development is kind of random. Why? Because the way it happened is, remember that real estate developers were buying farmland from farmers. But farmers were holding on to that land. They were not willing to sell unless something bad happened. Either the farmer dies or it's a bad crop yield. etc., etc. So we have some suggestive evidence that this is actually the way in which farmland was being converted. We're going to exploit this exogenous shock to the availability of land as a way to justify our exclusion restrictions. What do we find when we do this? Well, the first thing is that covenants do have a positive, the urbanized frontier index do have a positive and significant effect on the presence of covenants. This is the first stage. For the second stage, what we find is that for non-white households, when a development was fully covenanted, 100% of the houses had covenants, we're going to see a decrease in the presence of non-white households of 10 percentage points. This might sound small, but the average of non-white households back in the day was roughly 4%. So this is a huge effect if you put the two things together. Now, next we're going to test whether covenants had any other negative effects on ethnic groups beyond non-white households. So here we're going to test for some white minorities. Then in here, we're going to leverage the knowledge of our friend Homer Hoyt, who was like a distinguished urban planner in the 30s and wrote this book, 100 Years of Land Values in Chicago. And in this book, we have this classification in which Homer Hoyt classifies different ethnic groups from most desirable to least desirable from a real estate industry point of view. So because of lack of, we don't have a ton of power to do 10 groups and go so granular, we're actually going to group these groups into 4 bigger groups. And this is going to be our dependent variable in the next slide. So what do we find? Some of these are underpowered because we don't have, like minorities were not a huge chunk of the population, or at least not these minorities were a big part of the population, so we don't have enough variation. But we do find that the covenants had a negative and significant effect for white, Eastern and Southern European immigrants. So think about people from, I don't know, what's Yugoslavia today, or Czechs, or Polish, or people from Spain, or people from Greece, etc., etc. Okay. Yes, Camila.
Where they put the covenants that all correlated with like where the minorities used to live,
And
by the Mississippi River or far away.
we can test for that.
Part is curiosity, part is like how does that influence the instrument? It's like,
Yeah, so we can test for that. We haven't done it. So that would violate our exclusion restrictions if people wanted to wanted neighbors in other parts, like next door, to live next to them. So, or to be, so we can test for that. Yes, we haven't done it, but yeah.
and then back to your earlier descriptives, when you're talking, do you think this?
But it has to be, because of the urbanized frontier index, is that you only care about minorities towards the citizen. So that's why, but we can definitely, yeah.
And then back to the description. So you're capturing basically right after the post maximum covenants. Do you think this is where like people would also be like maximally affected by the covenants as well? Because people are like moving in and moving out, and like
I
there's
don't
this
know.
dynamic thing.
I don't know. I wish we could do something better in terms of, but the problem is that we need to, in order to answer that, so the 1950 census has been released, but I don't think it includes some of the variables that we need for this analysis, or not the current version. And the 1930 census, we can digitize it and try to test whether there's some dynamic effect. Actually, at some point, we were thinking of doing a follow-up project in which we try to measure like the dynamic effects of this covenant. To give you unsatisfying, like not fully satisfactory answer, my co-author, the paper that I mentioned, she actually tests whether covenants had an effect today even after they've been ruled unenforceable, and she does find an effect today.
Yeah.
So it suggests there's some dynamics going on there, but with the data that we have right now, we cannot say anything.
No, that makes sense. It'd just be nice to figure out, like, maybe you're an underestimate because you're only able to capture one element at a time.
I think you want to think about this as what happens in 1940. We cannot say anything beyond that. So it's instead of like an underestimate, I would say like more of a short run decennial effect rather than like a long run effect after 40 years. We cannot actually with our estimates, we cannot say anything. I cannot tell you that, yes, we can say something about the long run classified in that way. So yeah. Okay, so what is it that I showed you some regressions and some numbers, but I always try to explain things with pictures. So this is basically the thing what we are testing in the background. This is the presence of covenants. This is share of non-white. That share of negatively affected immigrants. As you can see, there is a negative correlation. So this is kind of like the summary of what our regressions are
What share of the housing stock was covered by this?
Yes. I don't know the total stock. I know that, for example, actually I have something. This is for new construction. No. I have it for new construction, but we can do for stock.
It's not important if you don't have it.
No, but I want to show you here, covenants popularity. So this is only for new construction. So bear in mind, I don't know how much new construction is relative to stock. So for that, I would need to have that number, but it hovers like 10%. And then in here, when they're becoming the most popular is 30%. So, but this is for new construction. So I don't know.
Okay, thank you.
But maybe you can see it from here. So I don't know. That's kind of the best answer that I can give you right now with the slides. Okay. All right. So taking stock.
Yes, another curiosity. Do you know why the developers are like sometimes including some subset of minority groups and sometimes excluding other
Yes,
subsets?
that's a
I think
very
it's
interesting
marketing.
question. Because think about the different groups that are coming to the US are changing over time.
Got it.
So who's being considered as a less favorable group, it's changing. But also like the worldwide, there are like worldwide events that are changing who we view as a desirable group or not a non-desirable group. Caucasian race suggests that there's a lot of like discrimination against the Jewish people. And this only comes after, well, the Nazis and all of that. And that's something that happens in the late 1930s, beginning of the 40s. That was not an issue before. So that's why the language, you do see the language changing over time. Sometimes it's correlated with historical events. Sometimes they wanna disguise, like for example, the first covenant that I showed you that had very explicit language. Later on, when they say only from the Caucasian race, it's like they knew that the things that they were doing, they were not super ethical. So they tried to disguise it with like coming up with other terms. But it's changing because of different reasons.
But it's not because the developers are trying to target a specific minority group and they know they want to exclude the other minority.
It could be. I don't know. It could be. I don't have a survey of developers asking them like you were target. But my sense, actually, like that's a very good question because in a follow-up paper, we want to understand the incentives of developers to put the covenants in the first place. And there is this trade-off that the more groups you target, the smaller your market size by construction. But if you actually exclude, you can actually exclude groups in a way that you take advantage of the racial animus that existed back in the day. Because if you only want like white rich people, these people are very like price inelastic, and maybe you can extract a higher price just if you exclude everybody else. So because rich people only want to live with white. So we don't know now. It's gonna take 5 years for me to give you an answer. So hold on. So, all right. So the results are robust to controlling for housing quality as measured by lot size, different definitions of the instrument. We also have a placebo in which we do the frontier index, but instead of looking towards the CBD, away from the CBD, and we don't get anything significant. Bottom line, what we find is that covenants had a first order effect on the sorting of households, not only on non-white households, but also on some white immigrant groups. Together, these minority groups, what we classify as minority, is going to be 7.3% of the population of 164,000 households that we see in Minneapolis in 1994. But now, let me try to motivate our structural analysis. Covenants can shape residential sorting in two ways, directly via restrictions. Yes?
Can you clarify this negative impact? What are you saying that negatively impacting choice or?
Perfect. That's actually this.
Okay.
Because it's on the one hand, it's gonna shape what different ethnic groups can choose from, right? But on the other hand, it could also have an effect on prices, the thing that I was discussing with Camila. So if I'm changing who can choose to live here or not, I'm effectively changing demand. This might have a equilibrium effect that is gonna trickle down in who ends up living. So in order to disentangle these two things, we're actually gonna turn into a structural analysis. How much more time I have left to see how fast I should go?
25 minutes.
Half an hour? So,
Okay, perfect. So I don't have to rush. And then for Camila and my students are very familiar with this, but people who do not work on structural work might feel a little bit overwhelmed. So, okay. So what we're gonna do next is we're going to try to answer your question through the lens of a structural model in which we precisely model choices and how covenants are shaping choices. So we're gonna call this a two-sided matching model. We're gonna borrow from a literature in industrial organization, which is a literature on selective admissions, I'm selectively admitting who comes here, or this is for actually nursing homes. So who comes into our dialysis center, so who comes into my facility. The way these models work is that we're gonna have, on the demand side, we're gonna model that with a random model of random utility. And on the choice set side, we're gonna model it in a reduced form way of who can choose to live in this development in this other development. What is the idea? Conceptually, I don't know if you guys are familiar with Heckman selection models, in which you first have a selection on who goes into the labor market and who doesn't go into the labor market. It's exactly the same, but for choices. So if you got that intuition, you don't have to listen to all the math that I'm going to show you now, and you can just wait for the results. So we're gonna depart from like the standard location choice models because we're going to allow for differences in choice sets by different demographic groups. And importantly, these selective admissions, under some assumptions, can be estimated from the data. The key insight is that with this model, we can actually go from the observed sorting that we see in the data and try to disentangle what is preferences, what people want from choice sets, which is the restrictions of where people can live. Okay, so let's start with the first component, which is demand, what people want. We're gonna have a household I of type K, which is gonna be very simple. We're gonna have minority versus non-minority. And this household is going to be able to choose from the locations in its choice set, capital OI. the neighborhood that ends up being chosen is the neighborhood that gives the household the largest utility. So capital Uij is the indirect utility. We're gonna have a common component, delta J, and then we're gonna allow preferences for characteristics of the neighborhoods to differ by minority and non-minority. On top of that, we're gonna have an idiosyncratic Taylor-Shock, which is what makes this model a random utility model, and we're gonna assume that this is a type 1 extreme value error. Under that assumption, the probability of seeing household I in development J is conditional on having choice set capital OI is given by this functional form that is basically, it follows from the distributional assumption of the idiosyncratic shock. Now, selective admissions. What is it that we're bringing new to the table? So we're gonna say that this is how choice sets capital OI are being formed. And household I is going to have development J in their choice set if and only if the desirability of household I, eta I, is above some threshold. So if we don't observe this eta I, we're gonna assume it's a normal 0, 1. But if it happens that that household gets a very good shock, and that's above a threshold, this threshold for development J, then that household is admitted into the development J. Importantly, this threshold varies by race. So the bar is going to be different for minority and non-minority. Under the assumption that that eta follows a normal 0, 1, actually the probability of neighborhood J belonging to your choice set can be written in this way. Okay. Now, importantly, what is the difference here? Typically, when people estimate location choice models, this part of admission is completely ignored. So what we are doing here is that if we see household I being matched to the neighborhood J, we have to sum over all choice sets. This is the probability that this is your choice set, and that's the probability that you choose neighborhood J conditional on that choice set. Yes.
Just to make sure I'm following. So the only criteria that you're considering for whether or not a neighborhood is in someone's choice set is these explicit covenants and the price effect. Not like if there are other forms by which minorities were denied access to these neighborhoods, but not via covenants.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's a great point. We also have a baseline intercept, which is going to capture at the city level whether minorities or non-minorities are more or less desirable. But this doesn't vary with the characteristics of the development. The reason why we are doing this and not something a little bit more general is because estimating this model is computationally very burdensome. Actually, Jason, who is there, he's helping me we're estimating right now with maximum likelihood, but we have to move to a Bayesian method to be able to accommodate more general models. And the reason is because of computational complexity. Okay. All right, so we're going to jointly estimate the admission rule parameters alpha, the demand parameters beta and delta in a two-step estimator following Bayer et al. 2007. We're going to first, in a first step, recover this vector of parameters using maximum likelihood, and then we're going to project this common component of the neighborhood utility on characteristics to get the baseline preferences, or to get the preferences of the baseline group, which in our case is going to be the non-minority. Okay, so identification. Hopefully I'm gonna try to make this very transparent for those of you not familiar with this method. But how can we identify how things are shaping choices from utility parameters, from preferences. What we need to assume is that you have excluded shifters. What does that mean? It means that we need something that moves utility, but not the formation of choices, and vice versa. That's the assumption that we have to make. What is it that what are those excluded shifters in our context? What we're gonna assume for the results today is that covenants are excluded from utility, conditional on the demographic composition and prices. In other words, it means covenants are a means to an end. Once you control for the demographic composition of the neighborhood and for prices, you don't make a neighborhood more or less desirable by having that clause in your property deed. Yes, Camila.
Sorry, I missed this earlier. Are there people who don't get to move in at all? Or like, would
There's
the
an outside
good?
option.
And
There's-
it's just nothing.
That's
Outside of the-
Minnesota. That's Minnesota excluding Hennepin County, which is 3/4 of the population. But we're going to assume that covenants enter admissions probabilities, and we know that from the mechanically, this was basically a built-in restriction into the. This actually was a de jure restriction. What is going to be excluded from admission? We're going to have things in that capital XD, such as distance to the central business district or distance to streetcars, with the idea that once I control for covenants and prices, neighborhoods that differ in their distance to streetcars do not differentially discriminate. That's the assumption that we're making today. These assumptions are testable for this particular model, this simplified model. If we wanna, but the assumptions, and actually we fail to reject the assumptions, but they rely on functional form identification. Once we move on to more general models, like the discussion that I was having with you before, we can not actually test for this exclusion. Okay, I'm gonna skip this in the interest of time. So what is it that we find? We find the following. In terms of the admission rule, we find that covenants favor the admission of non-minority households, but they are going to deter the likelihood that a neighborhood is in the choice set of a minority group. So covenants had a negative effect on what it's covering the choice set of these minority households. Rents for non-minorities, like neighborhoods with higher rents, we find that those are less likely to be part of the choice set of non-minority households. We interpret this as financial constraints, as a form of, or like we're capturing a reduced form way financial constraints. For minority, rents do not matter, but we're a little bit underpowered here. Yes.
Are you saying that this is for a neighborhood that has a set of houses with covenants attached to them? Or are you
No.
saying the houses themselves that have the covenants? Because I would assume that if the house has a covenant, like this is assumed because that is what the covenant does of excluding groups of people, but you're saying in a neighborhood?
So this is a development.
Okay.
So in a development / neighborhood that has houses with covenants,
But not all of them.
not all of them, but in the data, most of them, it's like a bimodal distribution. If you see, either you see households that are fully covered, neighborhoods that are fully covered, or neighborhoods that do not have any covenants. So you can think of like a 0-1 kind of indicator for the entire development. All right. So, but this is not an assumption here. Actually, like this is something that we get from our estimation of which it's good because it reflects what they were doing, but there is no certainty when you do empirical work that you're gonna get things in the direction that you want. So at least it's reassuring. Importantly, we find that any minority household is 8 percentage points less likely to have a neighborhood in their choices. So just to begin with, even in the absence of covenants or in the absence of prices, minority households are gonna start with like smaller choices. On the demand side, both groups are sensitive to housing prices, but minority households are more sensitive to housing prices. One of the characteristics that we throw in our utility is if you have preferences for living next to minority households. And what we do find is that the non-minority group has a very strong distaste for living other minority neighborhoods. Here, minority households, they also exhibit a mild distaste for minority neighborhoods because we are not breaking down by income. We suspect that as soon as we move on to more general rules or a more general model, this is actually captured by minority households not wanting to live households of lower income. Importantly, if we ignore this admission rule, the first row, and we just go and estimate a model in which everybody can choose to live everywhere, we actually get bias estimates. The largest bias is in prices. And what we see is that we see people that are more sensitive to housing prices than what they actually are. And we have some nice theory results and Monte Carlo results showing that this is the type of bias that you expect when having higher prices makes a neighborhood less likely to be in your choices because of financial constraints. Okay, counterfactual analysis. So we're gonna ask 3 questions. The first question is, what if covenants had not been used at all? Let's say that we shut down covenants. The second question is going to be a little bit more extreme, and it's gonna ask, what if everybody can choose to live everywhere? And the final question is shutting down this distaste for living next to minorities. In all 3, rents are going to adjust to demand and supply. So we're going to recalculate rents so we restore market clearing. So this is the first counterfactual. This is the observed number of minority households. Let me show you what happens when we shut down covenants. In terms of rents, on average, we don't see rents changing a lot, but this masks a lot of heterogeneity. In some neighborhoods, rents are going up. In some neighborhoods, rents are going down. The number of minority households who lives inside the city, it barely changes. But the dissimilarity index, which is an index that you use to measure segregation, drops 15%. Where are these minority households going? So what we see from this map is that minority households are moving away from where they used to live, and they're spreading to other parts of the city. So what we see here, the bottom line, is that there is a reshuffle of the minority households inside the city of Minneapolis, and nothing much changing beyond that. Now I'm gonna go to this more extreme counterfactual, which is that I'm gonna shut down choices, restrictions in choices completely. So everybody can choose to live everywhere. So what do we find there? We find that actually, if I shut down choices restrictions, the share of minority increases to 9%. Why is that happening? Remember that I told you that to begin with, a minority household had a probability that was 8 percentage points lower to have a neighborhood in their choices. So that is doing a lot of this work. The similarity index doesn't drop that much, or doesn't drop more than before. We're gonna see dispersion throughout, similar to what we saw before, but to a lesser extent. Importantly, what's happening is that rents are now increasing by 14%. Why is that? I'm shutting down restrictions in choices completely. So mechanically, I'm gonna see an increase in demand, because now more people have any given neighborhood in their choice. When I increase demand, I'm gonna increase house prices. So shutting down choice and restrictions has actually important implications on housing prices. Finally, what I'm gonna do is shut down preference, the restrictions in choices, and also shut down the distaste for living next to minorities. What is it that I find is that actually now the minority households drop by a tiny bit, yet segregation is dropping by a lot. What is it that is happening? When I shut down the distaste for minorities, non-minority households, now the places with minority households suddenly become very attractive because I no longer have a distaste for them. Non-minority households are less sensitive to prices, so this is gonna imply a massive demand boost for those minority neighborhoods. If we put everything together, that demand shock, that positive demand shock for minority neighborhoods is gonna increase housing prices by 30%. We're gonna see, because now I don't wanna live, like now minorities and non-minorities do not have preferences for living next to each other, away from each other. This drops segregation by 74%. If I put everything together, what is it that we see? The key punchline is that there is this affordability trade. When we remove access, these access barriers, we see that rents are gonna raise from 14 to 30% depending on how preferences are changed. So one policy implication is that if we wanna have these desegregation policies that still are pretty much part of the policy discussion today, we not only need to think about like removing these restrictions, but we also need to think about how housing prices are gonna change. And if you think housing prices are gonna go up, probably you wanna do some form of supply side interventions too. Importantly, even though restrictions are an important driver of segregation, 23% of the drop in the dissimilarity index comes from restrictions. Most of the segregation is still explained by preferences, meaning that non-minority households really want to live next to other non-minority households. With that, I'm going to conclude and I'm going to open the floor for more questions. So what is it that I showed you today, or what I tried to answer, is how much of the observed residential segregation comes from preferences versus choice and restrictions. How did we try to tackle this question is we built this new household development level data set for 1940, Minneapolis 1940. And we imported the tools from industrial organization trying to, models of selective admissions, try to separate what comes from choices versus preferences. The findings is that covenants did create a barrier for minorities and favored non-minorities. Restrictions account for like a quarter of segregation, yet preferences are playing the biggest role here. However, if we try to apply policy, like desegregation policy naively, we still need to think, or like the bottom line of the paper is, we still need to think what happens to housing prices and if minorities or the group that we are trying to help are actually being hurt by these equilibrium effects. And the things that are in progress is we're exploring alternative shifters because we're not very comfortable with some of the assumptions that we're making in our structural approach. More general admissions rules, I already talked about that. And then we're trying to expand our concept of equilibrium in which the minority composition adjusts also endogenously and is an equilibrium outcome. And that's all from me. Thank you, guys.
So I don't know a lot about Minneapolis, but I think one of the things you would see in this time period as well is that household size might vary a lot between, you would think typically minority areas had more people in one household than non-minority areas. Is that something that you also kind of
Yeah,
saw this as well?
we can
Yeah.
see that because we do see the number of people inside a household and we can control for that. But yeah, yes, probably, yeah, I don't have the numbers for you, but I'm pretty sure it's very different, yes. Yes,
Can be
Camila?
counterfactual. Do you know how people's like access to amenities also change? I think that's also interesting, like.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, we don't know. I mean, we know, but I don't have it here. But it's easy to compute, yes.
And then another thing, it's very big brain and probably you shouldn't and can't do, but we think of like having a house as a way to build wealth, historically at least. So it'd be cool to say something like these people would have been able to build a lot more wealth, even just by the 23%, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, we can do that with some assumptions that some people might not be very comfortable with.
Yeah.
What I can tell you is that we do have data on who's a renter and an owner. So we can try to estimate different preferences and have presumably different models for a renter versus a homeowner and try to capture what you're saying. So
I think even just saying like, I think a lot of people wouldn't like this either, but like nowadays, this area by the lake in Minneapolis is worth $1 million. And this area is only worth $100,000. And if people had been allowed to own here, now they would have built that much more money.
yeah, I don't think that question belongs to this paper.
Yeah.
I think that question probably belongs more to the like dynamic paper that we
Yeah.
were talking before. So my sense is that I'm not going to please you now. But yeah, that's something that it's definitely very interesting because I think it's not only relevant for this context, but I think in the American context, most of the wealth accumulation happens through home ownership. So it's something interesting to see too. Yes, Alex?
How should I think about other forms of white exclusion besides covenants? Are covenants proxying for them? Are they showing up in the distaste? Right.
So what we're gonna do is, let me go back to the. So right now we have a super simple model. Once we move on to this Bayesian estimation method, our hope is to do several things. One of the things is to incorporate an eta ij here and an observable that may vary by group. The idea is that similar to the demand model in which you have a common component and then things that differ by race, we're gonna, like if you wanna throw in more covariates, good. Otherwise, the remaining parts are gonna be capturing the eta ij. Chris, sorry, you were.
The preferences result is, I think, striking and how large it is. Are you able to decompose the preferences amongst the respective groups? Like, are you just turning off the white groups distaste for living near non-white groups? Are you turning off all groups' preferences with respect to who they?
I'm turning off all group preferences, but we can do a more subtle decomposition.
Yeah, I guess I'm curious, like, if you were to further decompose that into like how much is due to white preferences.
Yes.
So a little unclear what the non-white groups preferences were. Maybe I think at one point it was, that they also had a distaste.
Yeah,
for
but way smaller. Yes.
non-white
Yeah.
groups. So
No. Yeah.
interesting to just know like where this.
Absolutely. And like the counterfactuals that I showed you is like comparing to equilibrium. Like I shut down something, I run the algorithm, and then I get new housing prices. But it's also interesting to shut down like a channel every step, like one step at a time, and see like do a decomposition for each of the counterfactuals. Yes, we can do that. We've done it. We don't have it on the slides because then people will hate me. But we've done it, and I should learn the answer for the next time I present this. Yes. Yeah.
I had a question about other types of covenants. So you read a lot of covenants. Do you see co-occurring with the explicit racial covenants economic, covenants that were intended to economically exclude for class reasons, which of course overlap with race. And then I don't know if you saw covenants that did not have racial language, but included these economic form, like a house has to be built of certain materials or has to be a certain size.
No.
If you saw effects.
So to answer your first question, we can check whether because we do have the language for the covenants data, we do have the language of the racial covenant. So we can do like a quick search if there is anything mentioned regarding class or income or some economic indicator that is not race or ethnicity.
It's usually the house. Like it's usually some attribute of the structure.
So now going to the attributes of the house, that was gonna be my answer to your second question. We only have the data on the racial covenant. We don't have the other covenants. Like we don't have the other clauses of the property deeds. This was collected, the covenants data was collected by a project called Mapping Prejudice at the University of Minnesota. And I think there is a similar initiative here in Chicago. I don't know how they are doing it in Chicago, but back in Minneapolis, they just tried to look for the racial covenant. They didn't, unfortunately, we don't have the data for it. I mean, we can go and digitize all of that today, but we don't have it now. Yeah. Yes.
This is partly about preferences and partly about the discrete same sort of period. And so, like segregation is really interesting in the 40s because what became sort of extreme forms of racial and economic segregation later on, like at that point, so-called ghettos were more economically integrated and in ways like change like in the next 30 years. And so I'm interested in like how do like particularly your sort of counterfactual findings, what they might say about the alternative pathways that the relationship between kind of racial and economic geography may have taken, and how much they sort of reflect the particular ways that, so like on the preference side, rural to urban migration that was happening, like less to Minnesota than to Chicago, but like that might have shaped kind of some of those particular preferences around racialized minorities.
I wish that's like a fantastic question, because I think one of the motivations for this paper is that in urban economics, people don't even care about thinking differences in choices or restrictions. And I'm also one to blame, because in my previous work, none of my papers considers that. I'm not saying that we're the first paper that considers differences in choices, but I think what it was very unsatisfied from that literature is that everything is loaded into preferences. So if you see like two groups that are segregated, what the literature has done so far, or 99% of the literature, is assume that there is a distaste. I have a preferences for living with my own type. What motivated this paper was, now we have like a small window in which we can try to make sense of what's in this black box of preferences. And I still think that with this paper, we are not still there yet. So now I think the next question is try to understand what shapes those preferences. Unfortunately, I don't think with this, I'm gonna be able to give you an answer. Ideally, what you wanna do, imagine that we have the perfect data. If you wanna see like the ratio, like the sorting patterns throughout different decades or time periods and across different cities, and probably try to see if preferences are changing over time and how those changes correlate with things that happen. So for example, in the case of Alex is doing great work on riots. So how the MLK riots affected the changes in preferences during the 60s and the 70s. With this, I don't think I can tell you more than what I can tell you today without making more assumptions to answer your question. But I think it's a fantastic question and somebody should be looking at that.